In this lecture, I'll discuss globalization, and you can see from this first slide here that globalization has many different meanings. We see with globalization this idea of disembeddedness or just-in-time production, the idea of offices that are interconnected with one another through the internet, but necessarily the idea of the cubicle can also take place in really anywhere in the world. You see to the right here popular conceptualization of globalization as economic globalization from an activist perspective against this notion of economic globalization and its impacts in terms of both environmental impacts as well as social justice concerns. And then finally at the bottom here you see the mixing of both traditional forms of dress along with the consumption of newer products overall. So this notion of increased complexity of identity and circulation of goods as well as ideas, which potentially can widen perspectives but also lead to increasing conflict over time. So in this lecture I'd like to talk about some of the key concepts of globalization. We'll discuss the notion of modernity, cultural processes, cultural imperialism, cultural hybridity, cosmopolitanism, and I'll end with a discussion of globalization in the context of food production with specific emphasis on sushi. Now, if we think about global and the idea of globalization, we can see very clearly that this is has been historically or has been probably more popularly conceived of as something that is relatively recent. However, it goes back much further than that. We can see recently, however, an increase in trade as well as transnational activity with the end of the Cold War, particularly with the image on the top there. You see the deconstruction of the Berlin Wall separating East and West Berlin, East and West Germany. And with this, a breaking up eventually of the Soviet bloc, which was to herald in a new movement in terms of the flow of goods as well as people across the globe. We see with technology faster and denser communication networks, and there are a couple of readings on Bolt that there was one reading on Bolt by McClard and Anderson that specifically references this in terms of Facebook and how Facebook helps to reshape identity, and individuals can modify their identity by who they connect with and how they post on Facebook, and talks about this idea of representation of self in the context and utilizing technology and the ability to communicate with others across the globe. Mike Wesch, in the required video viewing for this class, also talks about the power and promise of YouTube in connecting up individuals to one another, creating these communities which are not necessarily geographically proximate to one another. Again, with increased movement and flow of goods and people, we see an increased tension between and within cultural groups due to intensified mutual exposure across the globe. Now, if you look at this slide here, you've probably come across many of these things in different contexts and lay readings. However, these are all myths of globalization. This comes from Erickson's work on globalization. Globalization as a relatively recent phenomena beginning in the 1980s with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Well, we see earlier global attempts with empire building in the context of the Roman Empire, of the Aztecs, and indeed of the age of exploration, conquest, and colonialism in the 1400s and 1500s of European expansion outward. Second, that globalization is just a new word for economic imperialism or cultural westernization. And then what I hope to bring forth in this lecture and this week is that globalization is much more than merely economic imperialism or domination from the West. And along those lines, globalization does not mean homogenization. It allows for new forms, new cultural ideas to interact with one another and create new opportunities for adopting new technologies and incorporating those within the existing cultural setting. That globalization is fundamentally opposed to human rights, well, this would be along the same lines that you see globalization being referred to as economic imperialism or domination by the West as a whole through westernization. Indeed, we see that global processes are, in fact, part and parcel of contemporary discourses concerning human rights in terms of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and many other UN documents which specifically reference human rights. And that globalization is a threat to local identities. And indeed, whereas it can certainly be threatening to local identities, if you have things like westernization coming in or economic imperialism, you also see opportunities for resistance overall. So if we think about globalization, we think about a number of the different aspects of globalization. First, this notion of disembedding or the lifting out of social relations from local context of interaction and restructuring across indefinite spans of time and space. And we see certainly with things like Facebook, the ability to do this, or with workers that are in multiple offices or perhaps working at home, being able to do this as well. We also see acceleration in terms of transport and communication, and it raises interesting questions. And many of you had this concern about technology in one form or another and how it potentially impacts human relationships as well as community. And one of the critiques of an acceleration in terms of communication is that there is much in terms of information that's out there. Indeed, on the internet, there's a plethora of information about anything that you really want to learn about. But in terms of critical thinking and analysis, these are skills that are not necessarily taught through internet communications, through asynchronous communications, YouTube videos, and whatnot. And I like this quote here that comes, that Erickson draws from here. He notes that far too many suffer from chronic image flicker, synchronic experience of reality as images rich in details, not as lines across time, causal chains, and reasoning. One needs both, but the way it is today, the ability to think is slowly killed to the advantage of the ability to see and hear, taste and feel, an orgy of the senses that gives little space for intellectuality, for critical reflection and analysis. And indeed, we see this certainly on news media. Many of the major news broadcasting channels today, they have, when you're watching the broadcast about one particular story, they have 5 or 6 things that are actually happening on the screen, so it's difficult to get all of that information and actually be able to process it in any meaningful way. 2, we see this even in the context of sporting events, where you'll be watching a sporting event, say a football game, and all of a sudden you'll see information not only on other football teams that you might not necessarily like, but also information about tennis or what's on ABC across the ticker there at the bottom. So again, this idea of this constant bombardment of information, even in entertainment, this becomes more and more apparent. We also see with globalization this notion of standardization, which occurs with international agreements in terms of human rights agreements, rules of war, the Geneva Conventions, international agreements on trade. Indeed, these international agreements on trade, the WTO's, World Trade Organization's trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS agreement, is specifically, all of these agreements are designed to allow for the free flow of goods as well as ideas across the globe within a set or rigid framework upon which individuals and corporate entities can enter into contracts with one another. We also see this with chains, and I talked about this before, the idea of this, when you have Starbucks, it's the same Starbucks that you have in Pike's Market that everybody seems to flock to, as well as any of the other Starbucks, including the Andrews Library here in Bloomsburg. And then English too, this notion of standardization and communication with English, but we could also add Mandarin from China in there as well. Interconnectedness in terms of mutual dependence, and a lot of this has to do with comparative advantage of countries in producing goods. And then you have reliance upon certain products coming from certain locations overall. Movement in terms of migration, travel, and conferences, which would include both legal as well as illegal migration, and that actually goes into the realm of this notion of vulnerability or unwanted flows of people across international borders, or the unwanted flows of goods across borders. And then this notion of mixing, an increase in the number, size, and diversity of differing populations with different cultural backgrounds, and then what occurs during that actual mixing in terms of tension as well as vulnerability. Then the notion of re-embedding. So globalization is not only about this notion of disembedding or the ripping out of the lifting of social relations out of local context, but it's also about resisting these forces and providing alternatives through things like farmers markets or buy local initiatives or local exchange trading currencies or let systems. So all of these processes are notions of re-embedding and indeed global activism around promoting the rights of indigenous peoples as well. You see aspects of globalization in terms of technology and communication processes allowing for resistance to development in some contexts. Now, across the globe, we as human beings have moved more and more quickly over time, primarily through the use of fossil fuels, which have really driven both ideas and people across the globe at new speeds. But we see this progression with horse-drawn coaches and sailing ships from the 1500s to the 1840s at about 10 miles per hour fairly consistently. I should point out that systems of runners which are in place have been able to have much more speed in some instances of moving messages through a relay system of runners or riders along horses, horse paths. We also see communication systems which are set up in along the Chaco Meridian in the southwest, where messages could be sent rather rapidly from one high point to another across what is today New Mexico. And then in 1850 to 1930, we see steam locomotives come in. These go up to 65 miles an hour, and then steamships at 36 miles per hour, propeller, and then jet aircrafts overall. So that's the speed at which people are moving across the globe. We also see the increase in speed at which ideas are being communicated across the globe. And so in 1866, the first telegraph was stretched between London and New York. In 1870, between London and Bombay, and then in the early 1900s, Roosevelt was able to send a message around the globe back to himself in a number of minutes, which was very much elated at the time in terms of the speed of the progress. Now, of course, we see an increase in the speed at which messages can be sent through things like text messages, and this can also offer potential opportunities for democracy for individuals. For example, during the SARS epidemic, there was a very tight control of information. However, Chinese citizenry took it upon themselves to share information with those in rural areas, not to come to certain cities because of the potential danger of SARS in said region. So these communication technologies potentially offer liberation from regimes which attempt to control information overall. Talk a little bit about the notion of modern and being modern, and the notion of modernity as well as modernization. Modernity can be thought about as the progressive economic and administrative rationalization and differentiation of the social world, which developed along with the development of the capitalist state.